she insists that doing so completely caressed and addressed a noun, right? And that's what she says in Poetry and Grammar. But then she also said of that line that the rose is read for the first time in English poetry for 100 years. And she said that in Foreign America, talking about that same line, a rose is a rose is a rose. And reading this book, I kept thinking, can it be both? Can we use repetition, simple language arranged lovingly, to attend to and honor the language itself, the language as material, its sounds and its shapes, and at the same time, can we reinvigorate its referential potential, its meaning, its resonance with the reader? And I think that's what's so exciting to me about Knippen's work here, is that it says yes. Cole Swenson says that what his work is doing is the essence of poetry. And she's talking about how the sound play that drives his work is not the flip or intellectual play of an aesthetic fad. It's the serious play of a child, or of Gertrude Stein, testing the tension and the strength in the language by leaping headlong into it, full of more hope than wisdom, holding on to his roses and believing that they will keep him aloft if he can just say their real names rightly. This poetry is a marvel to witness and to experience. And that's how it feels to me anyway, and I hope you will feel the same way. So please welcome to the podium, James Henry Knippen.
Thanks so much, Dan. Actually, this book was selected for the New Issues Poetry Prize by Tracy Brimall, and when I talked to her on the phone, she said, your poetry sounds like the love child of Charles Simic and Gertrude Stein, which I hope sounds like a compliment to you. And I was like, yeah, that sounds awesome. I love Stein, I love Simic. So, and I've loved being at Wells for the past few hours. This is, being around people who actually care about and want to talk about poetry is a really, really beautiful thing that I don't always get at my institution. So the fact that we've got people in the room right now that deeply care about poetry and poetics is something that's really exciting to me. And I thank you so much for the invitation and for the introduction, for being here. I should have planned out this reading more than I did in advance. I've been swamped with grading and everything else. What I think I would like to do is just go through and read some of the poems in the book that I think are some of the strongest poems, some of the poems that I like the best. But again, as Dan said, if you have questions, comments, concerns, or anything else throughout the reading, please interrupt me. I'm happy to have a conversation about these things too. And I think the intimate size of this crowd could be a really fruitful place to have some really cool conversations. So anytime you want to interject, unless it's like maybe in the very middle of a poem or something like that, please raise your hand, please just shout out whatever you want to do, and that's cool with me. I'm going to start with the first poem in the book. It's a cleverly titled poem. Like a yellow light means drive faster. Like the metal stem of an umbrella makes one feel larger in a lightning storm. Like night makes passages vaster. Like death makes words mean more. Like rain fills footprints a fox left in silt. Like one's lips become lampreys, smuggling purple blood in death's wake. Like love is the word most likely to wilt. Like the heart is dragged like a lake. Like a good river hugs its cities to sleep. Like the nearest star to the darkness of shark eyes kisses the lilies alive. Like a slaughterhouse worships its guise of trees. Like a ghost bites the end of a line. Like a hawk forsakes a starling's feathers. Like a closet trapped inside a ghost opens and shuts like an aortic valve. Like a song despises the cage it weathers. Like a fractured bone forgives itself. Like a good moon carves its oceans askew. Like the human eyes sculpted into a whale sink back to a deeper, older dark. Like hope dismantles the gatehouse in you. Like the dead drag the moats of the heart. Something I sometimes ask other poets or young poets is like, hey, what are things you don't like in poetry? Because knowing what we don't like can be, as helpful as knowing what we do like in certain circumstances. And one of the things that often gets said when I was like, hey, is there any aesthetic you're not into in poetry is a lot of young poets say, I don't really like rhyming poems. I don't like poems that rhyme. And I guess, maybe one of the impetuses behind that response is that, we're introduced to poetry as these sing-songy, rhymey things when we're very, very young kids, and so we start to associate poetry, at least rhyme in poetry, with like childlike qualities. I love, though, that you brought up that I'm like a kid that's like also a grown-up, in terms of writing these, because you're right. I'm obsessed with rhyme, whether it's end rhymes like in that poem or in rhymes, but for me, if we give up rhyme as poets, we're not only giving up, a way of creating musical interest in a poem, but also creating meaning in a poem. Because if two words rhyme in a poem, it's not only a musical connection. You're also indicating to your reader, hey, look at these two poems or these two words in relation to like what they might mean in relation to each other too. And so I love rhyming poetry, and I'm kind of obsessed with rhyme. And I think I sort of had to unlearn my distaste for rhyme when I was a very young poet, just because of those implications that rhyme has for poetry when we're learning it at a very young age. I'll read the next poem in the book too. Feel free again to interject or ask any questions throughout. This next poem is sort of like a magic spell. It's called Moon. Wet moon on blue stem, if sound is enough, if sound is enough, trillium tryst, mouth full of dark roses, if image is enough, if image is enough, weeping gladiolus, frangipani at dusk, if fragrance is enough, if flavor is enough, moonseed paralysis, gold shadow of monkshood, if faith is enough, if touch equals faith, moons do not exist. Rose shadows wither when the hedge is on fire. If love is enough, chrysanthemum kiss, blue light licks the lakeshore. If the moon's a damned liar, if the moon's wet enough, incinerate this. That to me is an example of a poem that is more about its sounds than its meaning, despite the fact that if you really spent time with it and delved into it, that you could probably get some meaning and stuff out of it too, find things with, these transferable bits of knowledge you could take with you. But that poem is very much initially dictated by the way I was hearing sounds in my head. And I'm obsessed with moons. What's that? No, go, yeah, please.
Can I ask how, so I've been looking, I'm turning poems into monologues in my class. How does the inclination to read get a more emotive voice instead of like a reading voice? Does that come to you naturally? Is that an intentional thing? Do you practice?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Like, so you're commenting on the way I'm reading these poems?
You just
Oh,
read
yeah.
them kind of, not angrily, a little angrily, though.
Oh,
Intensity,
that's,
Yeah.
for sure.
oh, I get really intense about poetry. It's the thing. It's the thing I care. Well, I don't know if it's the thing Yeah, it's one of the things I care most deeply about in the world. So yeah, I approach thinking about and reading poetry with a certain level of intensity. Yeah, I hope I don't seem like an angry person when I'm up here like the moon, But like,
Just distraction. Everybody wants attraction.
yeah, sure. Well, yeah. So and you framed it in such a beautiful way. It's the difference between my something voice and a reading voice.
Yeah, an emotive voice.
Emotive voice versus a reading voice. Poetry, began as a sort of oral art, and I go to a lot of conferences. I go to a lot of poetry readings, and there's a thing people do where they stand up there and they want it to just be like it is on the page, the words on the page. So somebody will read something without emoting whatsoever, just to let people, like the language wash over people, that sort of a thing. But as far as I'm concerned, like I'm up here presenting art. I don't know if I'm reading in an intentionally artful way, but it's I guess I'm reading these poems the way that I hear them when I write them, with that sort of a level of intensity. I don't know if that answers your question or not. Some of my favorite people to read their poetry aloud are very emotive readers. I don't know if you've ever heard Carolyn Forche read poetry aloud. It's very emotive and beautiful. Mary Ruefle is I think a wonderful reader of her work, and her prose too. Hearing that aloud is just it's wonderful. The sort of deadpan, like sad humor that's present, you know, when she's reading is wonderful. But yeah, I don't know if it's something that I'm thinking like I need to perform this, you know, so much as it's something that feels naturally right based on that's the way I hear the poems in my head when I was composing them. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Beautiful question. Yeah. Other questions before I move on? Let's see. You know, next I'm going to read. Why not? I'm going to read Pillow Talk, which is a love poem. Pillow Talk. No, what you need to understand is that when I speak of love, I speak of a literal interpretation of the word. Not of what warms itself between two palms, nor of what the torso skin will speak upon a cheek's caress. No, when I speak of love, I speak of a literal interpretation. Not of that between a woman and a man and a man, nor of that between the woman and the snake who conceived a child and named her Heaven. I do not speak of the burden of a brother fated to flames. No, when I say love, I mean it in a literal sense. I do not speak of daisies or of lilacs, or mean to suggest the corpulence of red, or purple berries, or of shadows casting grasses soft as cushions. I do not speak of reincarnation or resurrection. No, I do not speak of a whale's material, heart, or the ocean in any sense. No, I speak love literally. I do not speak of the ghost of a breath, or in a breath, or of a father. I do not speak in my father's voice when I speak of love. I do not speak the gust from the word, nor the word. I speak no letters when I speak of love. I am prohibited to speak of it beyond the hole and the zero that surrounds it when I speak it. Which I don't believe at all, by the way. Like, love is like the best thing ever. It's, you know, maybe my favorite abstraction. But that poem sort of wrote itself based out of sound. But I think there's definitely a truth to it in some way, shape, or form. We looked at a Jack Spicer poem called For Jack earlier. That its tonal variety hinged on the absolute mystery surrounding this word love. And I think this is a poem that sort of gets to that, you know, this undefinable thing. But yeah, you got
Just that as a first line of a love poem. No, what you need to understand is.
Yeah,
unexpected opening.
It is an unexpected opening. It used to be when I would read that poem before this book was published, usually my spouse would be in the room, and I'd be like, hey, my spouse is here. I'm so happy that she's here for this reading, so I wanted to read a love poem. And then I open with that, and everybody starts laughing. Yeah. So it sort of started as a little bit of a joke. And I think there's still some humor in it, especially after a title like Pillow Talk. You know, you think of like this romantic conversation, and then there's that tonal juxtaposition in the very first line, creating that sense of surprise, which is just a sort of pleasure that you can do in poetry, those tonal juxtapositions between titles and the content of the poem. But then I think the poem's tone continues to sort of shift throughout too. So yeah.
Can I ask you about the last couple lines too?
You could try, yeah.
Okay. When I speak of love, I am prohibited to speak. Did you think about what that's?
Yeah, I think it's entirely ironic. It's like it's stating the impossible essentially,
Okay.
and sort of like trying to define love as a sort of impossibility. You know, just with everything that revolves around it in terms of human beings thinking about it. Yeah. Yes, I absolutely know that I'm like contradicting myself at the end of the poem. Absolutely, yes. I'll read the next poem, Portents. Actually, I'll read these next two poems, Portents. Or we are an ocean thrown across the surface of a leaf turning, or all color will evaporate, like a lake where fish once glowed and swam, like little moons here and there. Or cockroaches and roses will hold communion in the fallout of our thinking, or the mind is water in a wicker basket, or the hungry knife will be eaten by a hematic anti-mirror, or what was a voice will be replaced by a hole whose limit is the sound of blood moving through you like wind, or the last light will go out, or a miracle may invade the natural, or it is already too late. Poem. I wanted to rescue the moon. from our hopes. I wanted to rescue our hopes from hell. I wanted to rescue hell from existence. I wanted to rescue existence from itself. You know, that last poem, that short one, that is a perfect example of a poem that wrote itself. That came out of me very quickly. I had really no idea where it was coming from, but I had a line that I liked. I wanted to rescue the moon. I wanted to use that line in a poem. And it just logically, what do you rescue the moon from? Well, maybe all the hope that we put in it when we look up to the sky. And then what comes after hope? Well, hell. What comes after hell? Its very existence. And what can you rescue existence from, other than itself?
I want to just, because you brought this up, one of the things that I've noticed about like most of the poems that you've already shared, and a lot of the poems in the book, is that the parts that call attention to themselves are like the wild images and the insistent sounds, but they all seem to be built on an architecture of like helping language. I'm thinking about like, if blank is enough for moon, right, as the recurring thing, or even just like the anaphora of like in the very first poem and poem.
Mm-hmm.
And then the ors that sort of dominate the sentence importance, right? Like there's these words that don't call a ton of attention to themselves in terms of like linguistic pyrotechnics, but seem to drive, like to be part, like an integral part of the engine that's driving the poem forward.
Absolutely. I mean, even though they're not like linguistically pyrotechnical sorts of words, they still contribute to the linguistic pyrotechnics of a poem based on the way that their rhythms are working within particular lines. And certainly that anaphora, you know, that repetition of even a word that isn't like some wild word that we don't hear all the time, can still lend a really propulsive musical element to the poem, I think. And I think that's maybe what's happening with a poem like Portents, starting with or the whole time. You know, it's kind of fun coming out of the title Portents and then just getting or all the time. I mean, that's one kind of a musical pleasure. But yeah, I mean, or is not a word that we typically think about all the time as being some like, ooh, I'm going to use the word or in a poem today. I want, you know.
I guess that was sort of my question is,
Yeah.
do you recall when you're composing these, or when you're composing new poems now, like, do you find yourself drawn to those sorts of like that kind of anchor language for whatever reason, or does it, like, do the poems begin in image and then you're just finding that language to sort of keep them running, or like what's the relationship between those impulses?
Yeah, both.
Yeah.
It depends on the poem entirely. Like, you know, I think with a poem like Portents, and with a poem like the first one I read, poem, like the whole time, I started with some lines I liked that just happened to have those things in common. And then I was like, well, maybe this is the impetus for the poem. Maybe this becomes a list poem in some way, shape, or form. And I'm really drawn, if you read my book, you know, I'm drawn to list poems. I feel like it's the only thing I know how to write. Sometimes that's the way I can feel. But yeah, it depends entirely upon the poem. You know, lots of poets say this. They start with a scrap of language that they like, and then they see musically where it takes them. You've probably heard poets convey that before, and that's true of me also. But you know, the poems I'm writing now are not as much based in like those small sorts of words. What I'm currently working on is a little bit different. But yeah, certainly like for this particular book, I would have some lines I liked that had that sort of repetition. I would say like, okay, maybe that's like the conceit for the poem, and see where it takes me, you know? Yeah. Next one I'll read is called, I'll jump to couplets for hopelessness. I want to make a beautiful song. A wasp is dying inside the guitar. An early snowfall bells the trees, the moon in untangleable yarn. The fog is a distant bell, rings out. Boats are burning on the river. Two pairs of eyes erect a bridge, the moon a moth-shaped riddle. They say to exist is to occur forever. Death, like sex, invents a skeleton. Like love, an echo is usually two, the bullet a clue nothing comes of. Fall where scarecrows like a rite, church bells dawn like bloodletting, prayer encircles a storm in skin, the dead doe's black eye rippling. We exchange pain like a currency, my blood spins like a clock. Birds gather like applause on wind. Is my soul an empty mailbox? The wind is a shawl, is apt enough. Did you name your shadow after love? Crow and fox blood look the same. Did you call your soul a tattered moth? But wasn't the soul the beauty of its own saying, form more malleable than air? Wasn't the wind a way of believing that the soul was there? I once believed the soul was there. Night is a crow pecking headstones. My skin disguises the gore of me, the same that hides your bones. There's another rhyming poem. Actually, that poem ends with headstones. I'm going to jump to the last poem in the book, which has also got a bunch of headstones in it. I'm going to preface this one, actually. This last poem in the book, it just repeats the same line, essentially, 4 times in a row with different line breaks. But this poem was in part inspired by one of my favorite poems by a poet named Mark Strand. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Mark Strand's Elevator. People know this poem? I'll recite it. I think I know it. I've recited it enough times that I should know it. Elevator. It's in 2 parts. Elevator. 1. The elevator went to the basement. A man stepped in and asked if I was going up. I'm going down, I said. I won't be going up. 2. The elevator went to the basement. A man stepped in and asked if I was going up. I'm going down, I said. I won't be going up. Poem. And I was like, wow, that's so cool. Like 2 short, I think it's like a 3-line section, just repeated one on top of each other. For some reason, the repetition of that makes it so much cooler and creepier and more, ghost story-esque than it would be if you just got it the one time, which frankly wouldn't be a very good poem if it was only the stanza the one time. And I was like, I kind of want to play around with that. And certainly, Mark Strand and me are not the only, 2 writers to have repeated the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. But I wanted to play around with that. So this is the last poem in the book. It's called Lilies. My inheritance is the names of flowers, my tongue, a red headstone speaking the names of lilies. My inheritance is the names of flowers, my tongue, a red headstone speaking the names of lilies. My inheritance is the names of flowers, my tongue, a red headstone speaking the names of lilies. Our inheritance is the names of flowers, our tongues, red headstones speaking the names of the lilies. There's another example of a small little word coming in to try to create some impact at the end. The article "the" is not before lilies in this poem until the very last use of the word lilies, which I thought was just sort of like a fun inversion that got you to maybe think about what was going on in the poem in a different way. But,
We talked about that in class today.
Did you?
That very phenomenon, actually, yeah.
Oh, cool, yeah. I mean, it can be a really, it's something that a reader will notice, It's subtle, but a reader will notice that, and then you need to go back and look at it again. It makes you want to read the poem again and figure out what's going on there. How are we doing on time? Do I have time still?
Yeah.
Plenty of time?
Yeah, you're great.
Good. All right.
36.
What's that?
7:36.
So, okay, cool. Any questions or anything else before I keep reading?
Yaya had a question, but she was upset that she couldn't be here.
Yeah.
Do you remember what her question was?
I don't
I think it was something like, why wren? Is wren a special bird for you?
Yes.
Because the wren appears frequently in the book.
The wren is all over this book. Wrens, moons, ghosts, they're all over the place. Yeah, wren is a special word for me for a number of reasons. First of all, I like saying the word. I like the way my mouth feels when I say wren, the way that my lips have to curl up, and it's different than saying wrench or something too, I just like the sound of the word in my mouth, the feel of the word in my mouth. And there's a tangible pleasure in reading poetry aloud. It's not just an oral thing, it's also like a physical thing that you feel and experience as you're reading it. So that's one reason I like the wren. Another reason I like the wren is because it's a really, small, like unassuming looking sort of bird, but its song is like beautiful and really loud. And so I don't know, maybe it's like an image from my own life. I'm not somebody who was like, super like popular in school or anything like that. I was sort of like my own little, person, like off doing my own things, but I was obsessed with creating art and sound in particular, with music and stuff like that when I was young. So maybe like symbolically the wren is important to me for that reason. And then thirdly, we had a wren house in my backyard when I was a kid, and we would wait to see if a wren would come back year after year, and my dad was always talking about wrens. There's a line in one of these poems like finicky as wrens. That comes from something my dad said to me when I was a little kid. He's like, hey, wrens are really finicky. I don't know if we're gonna get the wren back in the house this year. I'm like, finicky as wrens is definitely going into my book. But yeah, there's all sorts of reasons I like wren. The primary reason I think being that I just like the way it sounds. Same with the word moon. There's moons all over this book. Moon was my first word when I was a baby. My dad tells the story about how, he had me on his back in some sort of a thing, and I looked up at the sky and went, oon, 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 before I said mama or dada or anything else like that. But, maybe that's just like a family thing, because I think my sister's first word was balloon, which is a rhyme, so who knows. But moon is also one of my favorite words. There's this thing that some poets like to say is like, don't write any more poems about the moon. Everything that can be written about the moon has been written about the moon. It's time to keep moons out of our poems for a while. That's something that I've heard a number of people express, and one of the reasons there's so many moons in this book is because I always write against what people tell me to do. Because I think to myself, there must be a way to make this interesting in poetry. The fact that you've given up is actually kind of a disturbing thought. For poetry. So that's why there's something like 50 moons mentioned in this book. At least that's one of the reasons. I love the word, and then once I heard that there was this sentiment about how we shouldn't be using it in poems, I was like, nah, screw that. There's going to be as many moons in this book as possible.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Off of that?
Sure.
So, I'm sure these are not all of the poems you have written, but it does seem like you are very comfortable working in themes or working with, reusing words, right? And people remember. Is there a way you approach that? Does that come naturally to you? How do you let yourself fall into the lull of how many different ways can I use this thing?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know if it's falling into a lull for me. Because when I start repeating those things and the anaphora starts coming, it becomes a propulsive force moving the poem forward rather than thinking to myself, well, what's another unique way I can use this? The language sometimes sort of takes over and starts doing things that I didn't even expect it to do. And I think that that's just sort of based on the way that whatever storehouse of images and stuff I have in my brain, plus the way my brain hears language and puts it down on a page. So, yeah, it's easier for me to write if I'm repeating things over and over again. You do get teachers who say things like, don't use the same word over and over again, otherwise, this or that. Maybe that could be good advice for prose. That's creative prose, maybe. But if you think of impactful speeches and impactful poems, there's so much repetition throughout all of them. I mean, what teacher would say to Martin Luther King Jr., don't repeat I have a dream over and over again in this speech. You've said it once already. It's redundant and boring. I don't think so. No, that's one of the most powerful and known speeches because of the anaphora, because of the repetition. So it's not about coming out, how do I get out of this lull? The repetition, once you decide to do it, is a propulsive force that starts bringing new content into the poem, maybe that you didn't even expect. What's the next thing that comes after what's the next thing that comes after or? That sort of a thing. I don't know if that answers your question.
No,
I'm really just speculating up here. I have no idea what I'm talking about. But yeah, no, I guess that's how I'd answer that question. Yeah. Other questions? Before I read something else? I'm going to read a poem called The Sound of Injured Rabbits. So, and this is sort of different than some of the other poems in the book, in that I think it's got more of a narrative arc to it than some of the other poems in the book that are much more lyric But this is a poem about tinnitus and hearing loss. Now, I don't know if people would get that in reading the poem, but you know, I taught online during the pandemic, and once I got back into a classroom, it was the first time that I was actually having a hard time hearing my students, and I hadn't realized how much worse my hearing and sort of tinnitus had gotten since I had been in a classroom. And this is a poem about that. I wrote this poem before experiencing that, but this is a poem about my tinnitus and about hearing loss, the sound of injured rabbits. The forest I grew was impossibly dark. I could not list the names of the trees. Dendroidal silhouettes fled into distances, insisting we hold ourselves accountable for the dream. 2 rabbits foraged a blue floor there, mutedly, luminous clearing that occurred to me as suddenly as traps then shattered their hocks, screams the shrill pitch of lost hearing. As I fled, they would not fade, as if sound could flower without wilting. I covered my ears, the screams grew louder. I came to a hallway, black with no mirrors, singing as I felt my way. L is for lacunae, A is for auriform, M is for Neiman, P is for solosis. The lamp I then held revealed a room where my father reads the paper, looks up, asks, "What sounds like the sound of injured rabbits?" This next one is called Sonnet. Lung, the wren's wherewithal, voice, mosses changing colors in the rain, spine, tide of stones, memory, a loose bone stirring in the utter breeze, skin, ignescent shadow of forest shoulders, blood, mortality grows like a tree, ear, the storm inside the cricket passes through the bedroom window. Tooth, the moon is in the hayloft. Mind, raven feathers in a wine glass. Gut, in a falcon's talons the snake becomes a limp bedspring. Liver, dead wasps gather in the rafters. Tongue, a mackerel casts pewter in a dark tent. Eye, warped classroom window. Heart, a gong makes headstones shatter. Bone, the chimney is a hiding place for ghosts. Marrow, the hush is deep. Hair, we would climb out through the sky. Hand, desperate as gravity. Throat, once a holy cannon. Soul, the voice recedes into radiating darkness. Any questions before I keep going? It's kind of a weird sonnet, as far as sonnets go.
I was going to ask, is it just because it's 14 lines, or is there a volta?
So yeah, that's a good question, right? Because I started writing this poem before I realized it was going to be a sonnet. When I took my intermediate undergrad poetry workshop with Tyemba Jess, he described a sonnet, and a contemporary sonnet is any 14-line poem, right? Which, you know, it's pretty hard for somebody to look at a 14-line poem and not think about it as a sonnet, based on how integrated the sonnet as a form is into the poetry world. But yeah, it's a sonnet for other reasons than having 14 lines, but they're really sort of hidden and embedded, and I wouldn't expect a reader to necessarily pick up on them. But there's some turns in this poem, and the turns happen when the images that follow the parts of the body that are listed shift. So it starts with almost entirely natural imagery. We get the wren, we get mosses changing in the rain, we get tides of stones and a bone in the breeze and shadow in a forest. And then we get ear, and there's a line break, and it's the storm inside the cricket passes through the bedroom window. And all of a sudden the human, the synthetically like human made, is introduced into the poem with the bedroom window, and that continues. We get the hayloft, we get the wine glass, we get the limp bed spring. And then by the end of the poem, after we get the chimney as a hiding place for ghosts, there's that break again, and things become much more ethereal and spiritual and ghostly seeming when like the natural and the human sort of start petering away. The hush is deep. We would climb out through the sky, desperate as gravity, once a holy cannon. So there are some turns that exist in this poem, I don't know that a reader would necessarily pick up on those, but I think that's another one of the things that qualifies this as a sonnet. One of the interesting things poets like to do is like think of a very popular common form everybody's familiar with, and think of to themselves like, what can I do to subvert this in some interesting way? Sort of as just like a fun way to play with poetics. And that, to a degree, was also what was going on with this poem sonnet. It's really a poetical exercise in certain respects. You know, one of the things I'm obsessed with is the aptness of metaphor and simile. You know, the perfect simile to me is something that is at the same time extremely apt. Makes perfect sense, but it's also extremely strange. Because that makes you think about something in a completely new way. And while there's not like similes necessarily here, you know, I have to think, well, after I have blood listed, because I'm going to list all these things, what language makes sense? That's strange, but also apt enough. Mortality grows like a tree. You know, I don't know if anybody's ever been to one of those human body exhibits where you see like the bodies without the skin and like the veins and the arteries are all branching off and look sort of like tree-like. Well, to me, that was apt enough, but still really strange. Mortality grows like a tree. So it's sort of a poetical exercise, you know, along those lines too. Though I think there are meanings you can get out of the poem. Clearly, it's interested in like, you know, the body's relation to the concept of the soul and those sorts of things also. Does that answer your question?
Sure.
I said some other things too that had nothing to do with your question probably, but hopefully I answered your question there as well. There's a lot of ghosts. There's a lot of moons and wrens in here. There's a lot of ghosts too. I'm somebody who's obsessed with oral traditional ghost stories. Every once in a while, where I teach at Utica, I teach a class called The Ghost in Literature. We read like ghost poems and ghost short fiction, and watch, you know, The Shining and talk about it and that sort of thing. I'm going to read a poem from a book called Story Told to Ghosts. And this is sort of an ode to my love of oral traditional ghost stories. And I'm not, are y'all familiar with oral traditional ghost stories, like campfire stories that people just tell about ghosts? I don't know if anybody's... What's that?
Wells has a ghost story tradition.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. I'd love to hear about some of Wells's ghosts afterwards. One of the first things that I did when I got to Utica was ask, like, okay, so what like ghost stories are there on campus? Because you can actually learn a lot about a place by knowing what the ghost stories are that surround a particular place. It's actually a cool way to get to like know a new area if you're in it. Like, hey, what do people say about ghosts in this area? Anyway, but yeah, so I love ghost stories, all the repetitions in ghost stories, all the parallel structures in ghost stories, the endings often framing the beginnings of ghost stories. These are all things I love about oral traditional ghost stories. The scary stories to tell in the dark books, which are oral traditional ghost stories put into writing by Alvin Schwartz. You gotta get the version illustrated by Stephen Gamel, or Gamel, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. But anyway, this is an ode to my love of those things. So instead of a ghost story though, I was like, what would it be like for ghosts to tell a ghost a story rather than have a story told about a ghost? And I thought, well, maybe it would be like about the living. But I would still want it to have those, like, you know, those things that I love about oral traditional ghost stories. This is what I came up with. It's called Story Told to Ghosts. The foxglove said to the harebell, wear your nightgown of existence like a spool does, as I do. The foxglove said to the harebell, smell sweet like the presence of bats. The foxglove said to the harebell, have your negligee woven from eyelids that flutter like curtains of a house broken into. But the foxglove's nightgown carried it away because it was made of flying bats. I feel like the whole point of that poem is to get to the last line. I don't know. Let me look at the time. Am I still doing okay?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
10 minutes? Questions?
Gabs, did you have a thing?
Oh, I just wanted to say, from continuing with the ghost stories thing, like Wells is like the third most haunted campus in America.
Really?
Yeah.
This
So
is the
there's-
third most haunted campus in America, according to who?
I think there was like somebody like there was like some did like both research and like did like some few articles about it.
That's super cool.
Because it's so old. and
Wow.
Because it's so old, and then especially with things like the Spanish flu that came through, or like a lot of deaths on campus, and especially how old it is and how it's like traditionally made from Henry Wells, like founder, one of the co-founders for Wells Fargo.
Oh, this is the Wells of Wells Fargo?
Yeah.
Wells
kidding.
Fargo, yeah.
How old is Wells as an institution?
1868.
1860? Wow. Yeah, so there's gotta be lots of ghosts on campus by now, right?
My favorite one is the little boy at Leach.
Most of the campus
He used to be,
Okay.
It was 1918, right?
Something like that, yeah.
yeah.
There's a little boy.
Yeah, so my favorite one is the little boy at Leach. He used to be, because the Leach dorm used to be a stable, used to be horse stables, and the little boy who mysteriously died there. And so the story is you can hear him run up and down the halls every night. He's clomping around.
We have a similar story at Utica, Marble Boy. There's a boy who used to play marbles in one of the dorms on campus, like before it was a school. And you can still hear like the marbles on the floor, like in the rooms above you, but then if you go up and look, nobody will be up there doing anything. Yeah, we've got a similar boy on our campus. We've got Marble Boy. You've got Leech Boy?
Yeah, the little boy Leach.
Yeah. Very cool, yeah. I forgot. That's right. Oh, okay, I got a few minutes still. I still got a couple minutes. What do I want to read? Y'all have read my book. If you have any requests, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to flip through till I find one that I like.
I do have my favorite one, which is the cat. I talked about it in class.
The cat?
The cat.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I'll read that. I never read that poem.
Yes.
Because that is one of the first poems I wrote when I was getting my MFA.
Really?
And somehow it wound up in my book. This is not, yeah, so if you go on and continue pursuing creative writing after your undergraduate, you can go and get an MFA in creative writing. That's what I did. That's what took me to Texas why I was in Texas for a while. And my MFA, you write a thesis as part of your MFA. It's a book-length collection of poems. And this is not my thesis, but there's a few poems from my thesis that ended up in it, and the cat is one of them. It's a very early, sort of poem for me. So I'll read that one, absolutely. This is actually a poem, and I don't know if you're talking about the poem that came up. There's like a psychic sort of thing that happens in this poem. The cat. When it sneezed, it sounded like a small bird landing on my shoulder. A bird so small it thought it had found a mountain there, and that the wall before me was the sky, and that the sky beyond the window was heaven, for which it flew into the glass that shattered loud enough to make me jump. But it was just the cat again, shamefaced on top of the table from which a glass had fallen. Yeah, that's an interesting poem, It's like you imagine the window, imagine a window breaking, like, and then the glass fall. Yeah, it's this is one of the few poems in the book that was based on an actual experience I had, rather than being based on me just liking the way words sound and seeing where that takes me. Yeah, I was cat sitting for a professor back in my MFA, and this cat, it was not allowed to go up on the counter. My job was to make sure this cat did not jump on the counter. The cat's favorite place was the counter, and there were like glasses and things up there, so I kept having to, take the cat on and off of the counter. But it was behind me, and it sneezed. And it sounded like...
Do you think it really sneezed, or it did that to get onto the counter?
Well, I don't know. But I don't know I'm not going to presume to know anything about how a cat thinks, despite the fact that I'm a cat person who has multiple cats. But what I will say is that, this cat, its name was Bunty. I remember his name. Bunty sneezed, and it sounded like a little bird on my shoulder. And I was like, that's a starting place for the poem. And I just, where did it take me? It took me to that sort of psychic connection at the end, and Bunty was always knocking things off of counters and stuff like that. So, yeah, I haven't read that poem in a long time. Thank you for bringing that one up.
It's my favorite one.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Do I have time for one more, maybe?
Yeah.
One more. I'm going to do one more. I don't know which one though. I should have thought this through better. Let's see. What's a poem that I like that I haven't read yet? And it has to end. It has to be the last poem. Wow. Last poem I'm going to read. Oh, geez. I'm running out of good poems to read, aren't I? I am. Okay, I'll read... a poem that I don't know if I've read it aloud to an audience since this book has come out. I don't recall if I have or not. It's a poem that was never published anywhere outside of the book. It's the fourth poem in the book. It's called Bed. And it ends with a line that I think is probably really apt in relation to some of the stuff we've been talking about today and some of the things I've been reading. This is a poem I wrote as a form of self-comfort after, well, I'm ending on a downer of a poem. Even I don't think the poem's a downer. I wrote this as a form of self-comfort after a fellow student in my MFA program took her own life. Just as I was getting really into Jack Spicer's Poetics of Dictation, letting like ghosts write your poems for you. Don't even worry about what that means. But anyway, this is a poem that was that I wrote when that was happening in my life. So I'll end with this one. This is called Bed. Here you are safe. You are safe among the ghosts and in their absence. Safe among the white lights and the ink. Let the white lights be your mattress. Let the ink be your blanket. This is the bed a ghost has made. You be the tide to the moon's procession, the full lung of the sea. Ghosts fill lungs like beds of coral. You cannot drown here. Do you breathe? The ghosts are warm and full of love. The sea is full of love and exhales. Look, beds drift among the waves. A basslet shimmers, wet stars shiver. An ocean could drown here. Here is a line and here is a hook, a lure of your choosing. Throw it away. Fishing for ghosts is like praying for love. Let the line disintegrate. The sea is not comprised of ink. Warm hands cup your heart. Gentle fingers rub your larynx. The white lights and the ink disappear, but the sea will stay. I heard a ghost whisper, here you are safe, and blow away. A ghost is nibbling on your ear. Thank you. And thanks again for being here, and thanks again for having me, Dan and Wells College. This has been a totally awesome day, and I appreciate all of y'all spending some time talking poetry with me. This has been a super exciting day for me, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, James. And I'll just close us down with my own thanks. Like, you being here are what makes putting these events together worthwhile, and I really appreciate it. And I'm always proud of the people at Wells who show up to these events and ask their good questions and show how like thoughtful and attentive and generous we are as a community. I think you show that with your questions and with what you're asking and with just your presence. And so thank you for being here tonight and all the other nights that have preceded this. And thank you to Shane for being our IT guru here, holding down the fort. And the series will kick back off next semester. We have a wild array of really cool folks coming, and you will hear all about them once I have fully confirmed the actual dates and places and times and whatnot, which is coming soon. But stay tuned, we're looking forward to a lot more of this. And I'll just give you a reminder, James's books are over there, and maybe you could join me in one more round of applause for our last visiting writer, James Henry Knippen. Thank you all, good night.